Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, discussion of the virtue of courage and the opposed vices of cowardice and rashness, which is quite lengthy and detailed, Aristotle tells us about 5 other states or conditions that a person could be in that you might say masquerade as courage. And masquerade not in the sense that the person is deliberately putting on a show, knowing that they don't have the virtue of courage. They might themselves be in the dark about that, be mistaken about the nature of courage. They may come from a culture that has these things mixed up. Aristotle thinks this is quite often the case, and that's why he's pointing this out to us. He wants to distinguish these conditions, which, by the way, are not in themselves bad things. It's better to exhibit something like courage than to exhibit something like cowardice. But he's not saying that these are totally disconnected, but they are not quite the same thing as genuine courage. So you notice that we've got all 5 here on the board, and there's 2 that are kind of connected with each other. The sanguine and the person who has experience and ignorance, and the sanguine are also kind of connected with each other as well. The first one that he starts out with is what we call citizen or political courage. Understanding this to be, you have to think about this for a bit. It's not even as if they had militias as such, where like all of the citizenry belonged to it. If you were a citizen of a Greek city-state, you were expected to do military service for the state. And remember, they lived in a time period and a culture in which there was no absolutely centralized authority. They didn't have nation states, they had cities. And the next city over might go to war with you. So if they did, it's not like 200 miles to their frontier. It might be a matter of, 5 miles or 10 miles, or, at greatest distance, perhaps, 100 miles going from one end to the other. So citizens were expected to fight on the battlefield and not fight at a distance with bows and arrows. They were expected to be the hoplites, the one for the most part. There was a couple exceptions, of course. Don't worry about that, you military history buffs. But for the most part, they had to have these heavy shields and spears, and you would go out there with a bunch of other guys and try to jab your spear into the enemy. That's pretty scary, because that other guy's trying to do the same thing to you, right? And you've got slingers slinging, balls of lead at you or stones. You have archers, you have all sorts of horrible things going on. So it'd be kind of scary to go on the battlefield. So Aristotle here talks about the kind of courage that is displayed by citizen soldiers. Interestingly, and remember, Aristotle is a guy who taught the Iliad as a textbook to Alexander the Great, one of the most heroic military figures in history. Here, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that those great heroes at Troy, like for example, who? Diomed and Hector, and presumably he'd say the same thing about Odysseus and Agamemnon and perhaps even Achilles, who Alexander, by the way, wanted to be. Everyone wanted to be Achilles. That they were not exhibiting courage in its fullest sense. Why not? Well, because the citizen soldier, or the person belonging to a Bronze Age culture and going off to war for their oaths or for their country or whatever, is motivated fundamentally by honor and shame, not by the virtue itself, not by recognizing courage itself as a good thing to be chosen for its own sake, but primarily they want to gain honor, they want to gain glory, but they also are motivated by a sense of shame, eidos, a worry about what other people might think of them. And we actually see, some of the characters in the Iliad blushing, right, when they're reproached. So Aristotle says this is really close to courage, but it's not quite the same thing. He also has some other interesting examples too. So he says this type of courage, most closely resembles the courage that I'm describing because it's prompted by virtue and by the desire for something noble, namely honor, and the wish to avoid the disgrace of being reproached. That's not the case for all the troops, and it's also not the case for all the troops in, for example, the Iliad. It says the courage of troops being forced into battle by their officers may be classed as of the same type, but the motivation is different. He says they're inferior in so much as their motive is not a sense of shame, a sense of self-worth, and not wanting that to be called into question, but fear. They don't want to incur penalties, and the penalties could be, he talks, for example, about people digging trenches behind their troops so that their troops can't retreat. When you're doing that sort of thing, you are not promoting courage. You're actually just motivating the person by fear. And if we think about how courage is actually acquired, and we take this out of the battlefield context, pushing somebody constantly into those things, forcing them to undergo compulsion based on fear, is not going to produce genuine courage. So he goes on and he says, in these sorts of cases, we're talking about compulsion, force being used upon a person. And he concludes by saying a person ought not to be brave because they're compelled to be, although that's still a good thing to act bravely if you're compelled, but because courage itself is noble, is kalon, is something fine, worthwhile, something that we ought to aspire to. So that's one sense of pseudo-courage, not quite courage. The next one is very interesting, experience. He says, those who are experienced on the battlefield, and here he's not thinking of citizen soldiers, here he's thinking about veterans and mercenary troops, the kinds of people who have done a lot of action, and they know more or less how things go. So when they see something that ordinary people, just putting on their armor for the first time would find rather dismaying or terrifying, they're like, yeah, that's not a big deal. They see all the horsemen line up, but it's uneven ground, and they're like, yeah, the horsemen aren't really going to get to us here. We're going to be fine. And so they have knowledge, like I put here, knowledge where others are ignorant. That's the advantage that they have. They also tend to be, as Aristotle points out, skilled at what they do. So, for example, he says they're skilled in the use of arms and equipped with the best ones for attack and defense. So they're like armed men fighting against unarmed, or trained athletes against amateurs. Even in athletic contests, it is not the bravest who are the best fighters, but those who are the strongest and in the best training. So, if you have, let's take our modern warfare, if you have the best technology and you know that you have good command and control, it might be a lot easier to be brave than if you're belonging to some ragtag organization that doesn't seem to have its act together and your weapons jam constantly. It would make sense to feel a greater sense of fear, right? Now, the problem is, this isn't real courage. As soon as they face others who are just as knowledgeable as them, and that advantage goes away, now they're not quite so confident and cocky about things. And as he points out a little bit later, he says, professional soldiers prove cowards when the danger imposes too great a strain and when they're at a disadvantage in numbers and equipment. Actually, their knowledge turns against them at that point. Citizen soldiers might be motivated by a sense of honor or shame or patriotism and say, we're going to take our stand here and fight those those imperialistic or whatever people coming in, right? We're gonna do that. Professional soldiers are like, we're probably gonna get slaughtered here, and I'm not really in it for the honor. I think we better get the hell out of here. We better, pack up our shields and take off. So they're not going to display courage when, in certain respects, it's most needed. Now, that would be the opposite of what happens with anger. And the Greek term there, the reason I put it up there to begin with is because there's actually two terms that get used pretty consistently by Aristotle for anger. When he's discussing it in terms of virtues and vices, he talks about orge. Here he's talking about thumos, which is a bit broader, and that's also a term that was used quite a bit in the Iliad and earlier literature. So what he's talking about there is, he says, here we go. Spirit or anger, right, how we want to translate thumos, is classed with courage. Men emboldened by anger, like wild beasts, which rush upon the hunter that has wounded them, are supposed to be courageous. Why? Because the courageous are also high-spirited. That's the way we translate thumoides. That is, motivated by this drive, this energy, this passion, this spiritedness, right? And this can actually lead to some very courageous-seeming action. So let's dwell on that a bit. He says, spirit is very impetuous in encountering danger. So Homer writes, he put strength in their spirit and roused their might in their spirit, and bitter wrath up through his nostrils well. All these sorts of things to talk about how people get riled up. And we can think about this in terms of on the battlefield. We can think about this in terms of athletics. We can think about this in terms of going in and taking a hard stand during that boardroom meeting that you have to go to. We can think about this in all sorts of examples. Confronting a bully for one. In all these cases, as Aristotle says, the person is fundamentally motivated by that emotion, by that passion, and they're not therefore being motivated by reason or by principle. So it's not courage in a strict sense. It's something that masquerades as courage, and it doesn't get you quite so far as genuine courage would. Not a bad thing, of course. He says, this form of courage that is inspired by spirit seems to be the most natural. And when it's an animal response, but when it is, as he says, reinforced by deliberate choice, proairesis, which we'll be doing another core concept video on, it can be steered into genuine courage. This can provide the raw material, you might say, for genuine courage, but raw material isn't yet the finished product any more than, a binding and some pages and ink is a book. So this is an important one to keep in mind. Let's talk about the sanguine then. This is similar, he says, to the people who have experience. In this case, it's not so much having knowledge that's been provided by experience, say knowing that the cavalry won't really be able to charge across broken ground, and it's more having been fortunate, having had things work out for you, having been successful. People who, the word here, elpides, literally means those who have good hopes, right? And why do they have good hopes or good expectations? Because things have been going good for them so far. They have been fortunate, so they can afford to be sanguine, right? People who've been beaten down a lot typically tend to either they are sanguine and they're nuts, right? Because it does not meet their, there's no connection to reality at that point. Or they, start becoming much more realistic or even pessimistic. People for whom things go well typically become quite sanguine about it. They become confident. They go in. The problem is what happens when that no longer works out. They are like the experienced people when things aren't going their way. That seeming courage, which is really just a matter of confidence rather than courage, breaks down on them. Aristotle also interestingly says drunk people are like this. Now we might say drunk people are also more like the ignorant that we'll talk about in a moment, But consider it. People talk of, these expressions like Dutch courage. I'm not sure where that came from. I'm sure somebody will put that in a comment. Or liquid courage, we say, more often these days. Dutch courage occurs, I know, in a Jack London story called Dutch Courage, but I'm not sure where he got it from. And he says that, this makes the people sanguine for the time being. The problem is that this can't really be relied upon. The genuinely brave person is able to do well, is able to act bravely, even when things aren't going their way. Even when, new things arise that they haven't encountered before. Let's talk last about ignorance then. This is probably the funniest one. And there are many, many cases of people who are quite bold because they don't realize what they have gotten themselves into, and then it suddenly works out for them. And then if that's the case, they can become sanguine, right? Or I suppose if they actually realize what was going on, they might become the experienced. The ignorant can often be quite bold. Like he says, those who face danger and ignorance appear courageous, and they come very near to those whose bravery rests on being sanguine. They're inferior to them inasmuch as they lack self-confidence, which the sanguine person possesses. When they realize what is actually going on, it says, when they've been deceived as to the danger, if they learn or even suspect the true state of affairs, they suddenly become quite scared. And then they have to backpedal. And then, that whatever courage they were displaying suddenly goes away. We have lots of movie characters who are like this. It's an interesting plot where somebody who's ignorant enters into a situation with a genuinely dangerous person, encounters them, acts as if they really aren't dangerous. The townspeople, I think of Westerns, right? The townspeople are just amazed that this person stood up to the bully, the guy who's been killing everybody else, and the guy who's been doing that backs down a bit, right? And now the person gets really cocky, and then they suddenly find out, oh, that guy's a killer. Wow, I almost got killed myself. And then they're faced with a quandary, right? In the movies, do they cave in and act like a coward? Usually if they do so, then there's some other, lead there to say, hey, you shouldn't act like that, right? You're not a coward, or don't be a coward. Grow a pair or something, we often say. Or do they decide that they're going to exhibit genuine courage? If they do, then they're no longer acting from a basis of ignorance, and they'd be genuinely courageous. Usually it makes for better press and better TV if they have to be talked into it, and then somewhere along the line they find their courage. But we're getting a little bit far away from Aristotle with that. So we have 5 different ways in which a person can seem to be courageous, but not actually have the virtue of courage.